Hello and welcome to Cherry Red TV. My name is Iain McNay and today we're going to talk about a very interesting record label, No Future Records, which was started in 1981 by two people. We have one of them here, Chris Berry. It was Chris Berry and Richard Jones that started the label.
Good afternoon, Iain.
Hi Chris. So it was a very interesting time, wasn't it, 1981, because it was the beginning of the second wave of UK punk. The first wave of the Pistols and the Clash and the Adverts, etc., the Damned, had kind of died away a little bit, and there was something brewing, something bubbling in the. It wasn't actually, the second wave wasn't so much London-based; it was more provincial, wasn't it?
I think the interesting thing was that there were small labels outside of London that were doing their little things. There were labels in Bristol, Bath.
It was Riot City in
Riot
Bristol.
City.
Yeah.
Simon was doing some stuff down there. And we just looked at the music going on. I was an avid follower. I lived in Malvern. I lived at home with my parents. And I used to go to Malvern Winter Gardens.
But Cherry Red were promoting it.
Yeah, promoting the
gigs.
promotions
company, yeah.
But things had got a little bit stale. I'd go to the gigs, see Hawkwind, saw some really exciting gigs. I used to pogo to Susie and the Banshees.
Okay.
With Robert Smith playing guitar, so that was a real halcyon days then. And I ended up working in the Ministry of Defence in Malvern. I ended up working with this guy in big office called Richard Jones. And he found out that I was quite keen in music. And he said, well, I'd be interested to come along and help sell some records at the concert, which I did. In fact, had it not been for Richard, I'd probably still be listening to Pink Floyd now. So he started pushing all this vinyl my way, saying, you really ought to listen to this. And my parents are very accepting, because we just had one record player in the house, and we used to listen to loads of stuff. And then just out of the blue, we were sat talking one lunchtime, and he said, why don't we start a record label? Just like that. He's obviously doing some work for Cherry Red, and we thought, yeah, why not? Let's go for it. Rather naively, all I thought I had to do was put an advert in Sounds, the music paper going at the time, and we asked people to send in punk and skinhead demos. Unfortunately, I gave them my home telephone number, so my poor mum would be fielding calls all day and all afternoon till I got in from my full-time job from these weird and wonderful groups.
It's interesting, so at that time you just put one advert in Melody Maker,
Yeah.
presumably a fairly small advert.
It was a tiny little advert, about
Yeah.
that big, because that's all we could afford.
And it got a tremendous response.
I think initially the first week it was in there about between 200 and 300 cassettes.
That's extraordinary,
Yeah.
isn't it? So there's all those bands out there that wanted to get records out and were willing to deal with a label that hadn't even been formed yet.
It hadn't even been formed. We didn't even know what we were going to call it. They just arrived by the sackload. In fact, I came home from work one day and the postman was complaining to my mum. And then I think we did actually get some premises in Malvern to use, but I still had people ringing me up because they still had my phone number. And a lot of these bands were actually paying to go into small recording studios and produce their own songs.
Right.
And in those days, I was just chatting to your engineer upstairs, but about what's done these days. In those days, it was 1/4-inch tape, and they'd often send the finished master to us. Very trusting, extremely trusting. I don't think you get that these days without a contract.
So you got this incredible pile of tapes, and you listened to all the tapes, or most of them, or some of them?
Most of the tapes. You do have to remember in those days the formats were quite simplistic. It was either cassette tape or a reel-to-reel tape. So I scrimped and saved and bought a reel-to-reel machine to listen to some demos at home. And we sat there and thought, well, what can we do with all these tapes? And that actually led to our first. We put out a sample 12-inch record called A Country Fit for Heroes.
That was your first release?
I think that was one of the first releases.
No, your first one, I think, was All Out Attack EP by Blitz.
You're totally right. It's been over 20 odd. It's 25 or 26 years, so it's a long time ago. Yeah, I've got to backtrack. The Blitz one again, they'd gone into Stockport Studios in Rochdale, and they'd actually paid for it all themselves, and they literally sent us the finished master. That All Out Attack EP is what they produced.
So basically, that was one of the tapes in this big pile.
Massive pile, yeah.
Came into your house, and you listened to that, and you presumably thought, "That's great. That'll make a really good EP." And then you pressed. How many did you press to start with?
Initially, we pressed 1,000. I mean, when I listened to the demo, I mean, it sent shivers down my spine. It was miles ahead of anything else.
Yeah.
In terms of the quality and the drive. We pressed 1,000, and we had one of the local printers in Malvern make the original gatefold sleeve. In fact, before I came down to London, I was actually looking on the internet and found on eBay one of the Blitz singles now is about £15-20 for one of the originals.
Yeah.
The first 1,000 had rubber stamps on the labels. We thought, well, we won't actually produce printed labels. It won't sell any more than that. So we got some rubber stamps. We got the records back from the printing press, and we actually stamped them all with the information on.
So they're individually stamped. Yeah.
Those are really rare now.
Yeah.
And it really took off, Ian. I was staggered. We were staggered.
So so you had 1,000 records.
Yeah.
And what did you do for distribution?
We spoke to friends in the music business, such as yourself, and at the time there was a company called Rough Trade Records going, and
distribution. Yeah.
We piled them in the back of my car, drove down to London, and just said, "Would you be interested in buying them?"
Right.
And they bought the initial pressing of 1,000.
They took the whole lot.
To the whole lot.
It was a good start, wasn't it?
It was a very good start, and there was a very nice guy there called Simon Edwards, and he rang me up a week later and said, "I think you better press another 5,000."
God, what a fantastic beginning!
Fantastic, and it really was the norm with a lot of our releases, that sort of response in the early days. And then a week later, he said, "I need 10,000."
But what was going on in your mind? You must have thought, this is just extraordinary.
There was so much going on at the time. I just thought it was fairly normal to do that sort of, get that sort of response. And at the same time that we were getting phone calls from Gary Bushell, who I believe writes for The Sun now, but he was writing for a music paper called Sounds.
Yes.
And he was ringing up all the time and to find out what was going on. So we had some of the memories a little bit blurry. It's over 20 odd years ago. But it was just, and all the time we had all these tapes piling in, and the Blitz single went absolutely mega.
And at that time there was an independent chart. It went to number one, I think.
It did go to number one in the independent charts.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I was doing a little bit of research before coming to see you today. I found out Sounds would actually print charts from record shops that sent them in. So I made up a fictitious shop called Punky Norman's in Worcester and sent my top 20 in, and it had a smattering of the Upstarts, the Pistols, the Clash, but we put the Blitz single in there. There was a local band from Worcester who we signed called The Samples. We put them in there, and they published it in the paper, and that was brilliant.
So right from day one you were fiddling the charts then?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you got off to a great start, although you felt that was fairly normal at the time. But I can tell you also being involved with obviously Cherry Red, to sell that many records that quickly is pretty phenomenal. And that must have obviously encouraged you to quickly move on to other releases. So what was your second one?
I think for the
You've forgotten.
No, it was the single. It was the Partisans.
It was Police Story by the Partisans.
Story.
Yeah.
Now they were a very interesting group. They were a young group from Bridgend, which has been in the press a lot lately for the suicide rates. Very young. I think they were about 15, 16, but they produced a really tight sound. And we used to do the long trek down to Bridgend and have lots of meeting with their parents because they were so young. The bass player was a girl called Louise, a young woman, and her parents felt that she couldn't go and play any gigs unless she had a chaperone. So we got a phone call one day from the agent who was handling Vice Squad, and they wanted the Partisans to go out on tour and support them. But Louise's parents felt it wasn't appropriate and scuppered it. So on the one hand, you had this quite ferocious image from a lot of these bands. The leather, the ripped jeans, the sort of the Dr. Martens, but really underneath they were pussycats.
Yeah. But it was, as I remember it, that the first wave of punk was, okay, it was a statement insofar as the record industry was just a bit going up its own arse, if you like, and you got to the stage of kind of triple concept albums by ELP and Yes, and it was all moving more and more away from grassroots.
Yeah.
And that was partly why the first wave of punk started, I was saying earlier, with the Sex Pistols,
Yes.
the best known one, the Damned, the Clash, etc. But that was also quite London-based and quite fashion-based as well, or anti-fashion-based. And it seemed to me that the second wave, which started in the early 80s in the UK, was more political. And it was to do with, it was the beginning of a recession, there was unemployment, there was anger at the Tories, and so it was a more genuine, for working class movement, really.
I think it was a very much working class movement, as you said earlier or a minute ago. The first set of punk bands were on big labels like CBS, EMI, Virgin, and this was very much have a go yourself. You could produce a record really cheaply. There was a lot of hostility in the country. I was speaking to a friend of mine lately who actually didn't know what it was like to live under a Tory government. There was a lot of hostility, particularly to Margaret Thatcher, and a lot of these bands just fed off on that, perhaps looking back now a little bit naively, but they were well into that sort of have a go, yes. Yeah.
I remember the first Blitz gig I went to in London. I felt there was definitely, whereas before with the first wave of punk gigs, okay, there was the spitting and there was the odd bottle getting thrown around, but you didn't feel there was a real edge. But I felt with that Blitz gig, the first one, there was a real edge there, and I felt a little uncomfortable. I was standing at the back there, and I didn't want to sort of be in the middle of things. They
were quite frightening, actually. I very much felt that, although I was dealing with them at the time, there was that sort of animal aggression in their performance, and it was always very much on the edge.
And the audience responded to that somehow.
Very much so. Previously, I used to do a lot of pogoing. I don't think I could quite do it these days. But, it was that sort of feel like, oh, I'm not very comfortable here.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was very exciting as well.
Oh, absolutely. You felt something raw and something new and very truthful was happening.
It was loud. It was very... they didn't really care. They just sort of didn't like the environment. A lot of these bands did actually come from fairly impoverished backgrounds.
Yeah.
They didn't have any jobs.
Yeah.
They could scrape together enough money to buy a pint. That was it. The prospect in a lot of their towns was fairly limited as to the work they might be able to get, especially around the area of the Blitz. Red Alert came from up north. Blitzkrieg, those type of bands. It used to be you went to school. If you were lucky, you went to work in the factory. When the factory closed down, there was not much else to do. This
is your chance to get out of your life,
yes,
as it was, which was a very limited life. This is the one chance to make money out of music.
And I'm honestly thinking back to the time, there wasn't the propensity for use of drugs really then. It seemed to be you'd go down to the pub and have a few drinks, or let's form a punk band. So a lot of people were challenging that sort of negative energy into creating music. I've still got a few demos at home. I listened to some the other day and I thought, oh, that's really, really quite good. A lot of them haven't stood the test of time.
Yeah.
But some of them really very powerful still.
So then your third release was A Country Fit for Heroes, which
yes,
you mentioned earlier, which was a compilation.
Yes.
Was it 8 different bands, I think?
It was eight or nine different bands. We were a bit naughty, actually. Richard pinched the photo without. We didn't actually ask the photographer permission to use it, so we pinched it from a book.
Well, you're punks. Why should you?
Who gives a what's it? We used to. Actually, the band supplied all their own. We took them from the demos, so nobody went into the studio to record, and they were all taken from the demo tape sent in.
Yeah.
And I believe, I think Cherry Red had released Pillows and Prayers.
Right.
at a very reasonable price, and we wanted to sell this record for nothing, virtually nothing. So all we did was the mastering costs and some of the artwork, and we released it and sold it really cheaply. Gary Bushell really liked it. We had loads of press in Sounds, and I think the first pressing of that was about 25,000–30,000.
That's extraordinary. Yeah.
And it just went like that.
So in those days, you pretty much relied on the press and a little bit of radio to let people know about the releases.
We didn't get much radio to start off with. In fact, Dave Lee Travis was on Radio 1 at the time, and he said if he ever had to play a Blitz track, he would actually leave the station. He said that's on air, and then going.
At least he knew the band, didn't he?
Yeah, moving on slightly.
Yeah.
He actually did play when their first album went into the charts. He actually had to play some of their songs, so that was very entertaining.
So okay, your first album was Blitz's A Voice of a Generation, which went in the national chart the first week at number 27. I remember it well.
Yes.
Which again was phenomenal, because here you were, two guys out in the sticks in Malvern in Worcestershire, working from a very small room really, and you suddenly had a top 30 album.
That was the one that we decided to actually invest, or had some funds coming through. The idea was, prior to that, we got the records in, we paid the bands their royalties. We didn't really think too much on the next release, but we actually had some funds available, so we actually put them in a reasonable studio, and we spent fairly big money on mixing the album. They might say differently these days, but it did cost a lot of money to record. But that produced that album, and we spent a lot of money on the sleeve as well. It was a full colour sleeve with lyric insert. Didn't quite make it to the double concept thing.
But for you, it was quite an expensive process.
It was an expensive process.
Yeah.
Yet again, although I'm going to sort of the technical side, really, we had, those days, you used to take the vinyl to different pressing plants, and to cope with the initial demand, it was actually being pressed in 2 different pressing plants.
Right.
That was such the demand in the initial, which gave us the initial chart position.
And what kind of pressing did you do initially on that release, do you remember?
That was about 30,000.
Yeah. These are big figures, yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. So then you had Peter and the Test Tube Babies. This came out as a single.
Peter and the Test Tube Babies, they had some success. They'd been on EMI, I think, and they had already had a couple of John Peel sessions. So they were fairly well known and well respected, and they had a big following in Brighton. And Pete Bywaters rang me up and said that they were interested in coming to join the label. Julie sent me a demo, and I was on a trade union conference at the time in Brighton. So I met up with Peter, and we ended up going to the local pub. And I seem to remember I bought the drinks for the band all night, but we all ended up completely slaughtered. And as a result of that sort of drunken escapade, we decided to sign the band.
Right. It seems that you didn't have to actually go out and find bands. They came to you. They either sent you in demo tapes, phoned you up. And these days, the record business seems to be all about A&R people going out and finding the latest talent. But you just sat at home and the phone rang and the postman brought you loads of demos.
They say, Iain, ignorance is bliss, and although I keep harping back to it, I honestly thought this is what record companies do, because we were based in Malvern. We weren't in London. We didn't have an A&R department.
I thought it was all so easy. I'm just going to, my foot actually moved that microphone. I'm just going to move it back gently. Okay.
Okay. The only bands we actually courted, and I did a lot of work to try and sign them, were GBH, who were very big at the time in Birmingham. I knew the singer Colin quite well, but they went with, I can't think of the label they went with, and
Clay.
And also we were trying to get Discharge, who were at the time again were massive, and I believe lately some of the American metal bands released some of their tracks. They were the only 2 bands that I couldn't get.
Right.
But as you said, no, people would come to us. They would literally ring up or turn up or send demos in.
It's a great business model, it really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It all seemed to be so easy, really.
Yeah. And so you mainly released singles. You also did a Channel 3 album. That was licensed in from Posh Boy in America, wasn't it?
That was licensed in. That was a slightly different departure. It was. I'm not certain now why we did that, to be honest. We liked that. We liked that as well. I was always personally a great fan of the Dead Kennedys. So when something came in from America that we liked, we thought we'd just release it. But it was literally a question of just release it and put it out. We didn't do an awful lot with it. But I still like that album. I still listen to it occasionally.
And the great thing is that everything you put out sold pretty well. Were you paying advances to people, or...?
No, we didn't pay any advances. We just paid them royalties when the record sold.
And you had this 50-50 split with the bands, did you?
It was 50-50 down the line. I can't remember all the ins and outs of the contracts now, but you see, at the time when we used to go down to London and go to the Rough Trade Distribution company, I used to spend a lot of time talking to Daniel Miller from Mute.
Yes.
And I know he had Depeche Mode, didn't have a contract, I believe, for years. I think I'm right in saying that a lot of his bands didn't have contracts.
No, there wasn't one for Erasure, I don't think. Yazoo, most of them he didn't have in the early days,
And he said to me, look, if the band wants to stay with you, you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And his ethos was, if they want to go, they'll go.
Yeah.
So we just had this sort of general split. 50% to them, 50% to us. Very strange. I bet you don't get that these days.
No, it's all a bit more complex these days, the whole thing. So I'm just looking at your schedule here. Then you had an album with the Partisans.
Partisans, yes, I enjoyed that. That was mixed at Southern Studios with John Loder, who sadly died a few years ago.
That's right,
But we were mixing the album, and members of Crass were walking in and out, and it was... I can remember sitting there drinking herbal tea one evening. It was all very interesting. Very interesting setup.
Yeah.
But at the time, as you said, I mean, it seemed so natural, and it was just so right. It seemed so natural, everything we put out sold. I'd think nothing of loading a van up at 3 o'clock in the morning and driving to London, sell the records. We used to sell them at the gigs, out the back of a van somewhere, so it just seemed quite right, really.
And A&R wise, did you always agree things with Richard, your partner, or did you sometimes have things you wanted to do individually? Was it a consensus between you?
Mainly, it was initially Richard's idea to get the label going. He had a lot more experience than I did. There were a couple of things that he released he liked and I wasn't so keen on, and there were a couple of things that I released which he didn't really like very much. But we just sort of agreed to differ on those, and generally speaking, they all sold. So that was the benchmark, really. So we were fairly happy about that. Yeah.
And what was your break even on releases, generally speaking, like 1,000 or 2,000?
It was about 2,000 copies.
Yeah, so long as you did that, you weren't losing money.
We were quids in, and the band won and we won as well, so we were quite happy.
And were you doing it full time?
I left my full-time job to go and do it full-time after about 3 or 4 months. I was still living at home with my parents. I had to persuade my father that it was a good idea, so we sat down and looked at some figures, and he couldn't really deny it. So yeah, I had a whale of a time, really.
Yeah. So here you are, trucking along with a great business, people ringing you up, sending you in masters, and everything sells really well. And now, here you are today, and there's no future. So what happened?
I think there was to go back, you said there was the initial first wave of the punk bands. Then we had the Riot Cities, the No Futures, the Clays, and I just overreached myself. I got more ambitious, and what happened was we did release some records towards the end, which didn't sell very well, which didn't go very down well with the press. But the production costs were starting to eat into our budget. Excuse me, and also some of the bands started to believe their own publicity. So whereas they'd be quite happy with a 16-track studio, they now wanted to come to London, go into Utopia Studios, and unfortunately I wasn't sussed enough to actually take any advice or get a decent accountant to go stop. So in the end we realised that we were not going to carry on. We were going to have to sell the label or sell the rights to it to get ourselves out of the sticky stuff, really.
So basically, Did the formula stop working, or you became more ambitious in yourselves, or a bit of both?
I think the formula had slowed down as many people discovered they could release records and make money. It got harder to find new bands. The bands themselves got more tricky. They wanted advances, which we didn't have. And also the actual music scene was changing again, which is why we had a go at producing a label called Future. We actually released a Blitz single on that, which ironically called Telecommunication, which got a massive amount of airplay from John Peel and David Jansen. And it sold okay. So it was radio friendly, but it didn't do nearly as well as their first releases. And they were accused of selling out by the press. And I think I'd had enough, really. I think I'd got a bit tired of it all, to be honest.
So how long did the actual No Future label last as such?
I think it lasted for about 2 years.
Right.
18 months to 2 years. I think there were about 20-odd releases over that period of time.
You had, see now I have it here, you have 27 singles,
Really?
7 albums, and then 2 Screaming Dead releases on a separate label, yeah. So the last ones were things like The Violators, Die With Dignity, Red Alert, There's a Guitar Burning, Screaming Dead, Night Creatures. That was the time you felt that it was starting to, you were spending more actually making the records.
We're spending more money. The Violators was an expensive single, although it's actually a very good single. I think they were very upset with me because, according to Ian Glasper's book, I actually didn't. I didn't tell them I was remixing the single in London. I don't remember that, but it may well be true. But when you start going to London and spending a lot of money in the studios, unless you've got the sales, of course, you sort of run into problems.
So you weren't really a businessman as such.
No,
you were a fan with a good idea and
fan
lots of
with a good
enthusiasm.
idea. Looking back, had I got an accountant involved, I always wanted to move to London. I don't think Richard was quite so keen for various reasons. Perhaps the move would have killed us earlier. Perhaps it would have made us more secure. Who knows? But I was very keen to move to London at the time, but it never really happened.
And did you have close relationships with other labels at the time? Was the kind of people that you could chat with about?
Yeah,
what was
I mean
happening
there was yourself. There was Cherry Red. We did a deal with the music publishing side as well. So there were people. I used to know Daniel Miller quite well.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually asking advice, very naive. I didn't think that I was right, but I just didn't come into my consciousness that I should actually ask for help.
Yeah.
And by the time it did occur, it was a bit too late, really.
It's often the case that businesses are doing quite well, they're expanding, increasing their costs and overheads and everything, and that's the time you have to be actually really careful because things start to level off.
Yes.
Or dip a little bit, and then of course the cash dries up.
Well, I would get a phone call from a band saying we'd like to remix a track, and I would go, yes, okay, where do you want to do it? And not really thinking that, I think at the time studios were £20-25 an hour, the expensive ones, so that was really eating into the budget.
Yeah.
So I was having a whale of a time. I was really a fan, very enthusiastic, but not with the right business head on, I'm afraid.
So you started Future Records.
Yes.
You had, as you said, Telecommunications out by Blitz. You also did a single by and also the Trees.
We did a first single by and also the Trees called Chantel. They'd got had a very close relationship with The Cure. People often misinterpreted that they were actually Cure copyists. I can only tell you honestly, because I was there at the time, that Robert Smith was actually a great fan of Justin Jones. He used to play the guitar and also the Trees. They had all the Trees demo tapes, and Lawrence Tolhurst from the band actually produced their first single. So they weren't Cure copyists, but a lot of people wouldn't understand that. But Robert was a great fan. In fact, I think he still is of and also the Trees. So
right. And they're still going, you were telling me.
They're still
earlier.
going. They're just in Europe at the moment on the European tour.
Yeah. And was it pretty much at that point you decided that it wasn't going to work anymore?
I think it was at that point that I really thought, well, this is just not happening. We need to get out whilst we can. Yeah. So the sad decision was taken to actually call a halt. And we'd done a few dodgy things. I think an offshoot of Blitz did a cover version of Bowie's Suffragette City, and really that was probably the end.
Yeah.
I was in the Stockport studios and they didn't have a vocalist, so the engineer, the sound engineer, happened to have a good voice, so he sang the song.
Huh.
And much as Nidge Miller from Blitz was a nice guy, he wasn't Mick Ronson, so that really was the end, I think.
Yeah. And what was your feeling at the end of it? Were you a bit sad?
Very sad, yeah. It was very sad. It was. It had been a fantastic sort of 18 months, 2 years, and then I thought, well, I need to go off and get a proper job then, really.
Yeah. What kind of job did you get?
I moved into retail.
Okay.
I've been a sort of retailer now for 20 odd years. Go and do some real work, I think was my expression at the time.
But you must be quite proud that actually the records are still very collectible. A lot of them are available on CDs, and they're quite highly regarded as records.
It was down to people like yourselves that kept the catalogue going, and a couple of years ago I got a phone call from this guy called Iain who said he was writing a punk book and would I go to Ledbury and be interviewed, and initially I just said no, I wasn't interested, or ignored his emails and phone calls.
Right.
And he persuaded me to go over. We had a great evening with him and his wife, a couple of bottles of wine, and his enthusiasm sparked off some memories, and yes, I do feel quite proud of what we did, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I do feel quite chuffed, really.
And you still like music?
Absolutely. Still listen to lots of music.
What's your current favourites?
Well, I'm very into Muse.
Muse,
I think they're brilliant.
absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
David Bowie is still God.
Yeah.
He went through a dodgy period, but he's still the master in my books. I quite like a lot of Nick Cave's work. But I'm going through a bit of an old fart phase at the moment. I've just found some sensational Alex Harvey Band clips on YouTube, and that was amazing.
Yeah.
A little bit before my time, that one, but they were amazing.
Yeah. So have you got any advice to someone that's thinking of starting a record label?
Yeah, get your business model sorted out first.
Okay, that's good advice, yeah.
Get someone in the background who's definitely got an accountant head on that will stop you going mad. But if someone's interested, go for it. Why not? Why not?
Good. Well, I'm just going to hold up a couple of these releases, which you put down some samples. That's Red Alert and Attack. And of course, in those days, it was vinyl. Vinyl these days is almost on the way out for singles anyway. Well, almost completely on the way out. But it was vinyl then. In fact, what's almost on the way out now for singles is anything physical. It's nearly all download. And they're all very collectible. And these are probably worth £10 each, are they?
£10 each, and that one's about 15, I think.
Is it really? Yeah. So it just goes to show you the legend lives on.
Does indeed.
Yeah. Thanks for coming in, Chris.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me down.
No Future Records, and thank you for watching Cherry Red TV, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.